In this video, we're going to take a look at how to print information to the screen using Python, and then we're going to also look at variables and comments. Now, in Python, there's a function called the print function, or you can call it a command if you want for now. And to print something to the screen, maybe what's called a string literal, we might type in Clint Eastwood. This is called a string literal because it's not being stored in memory. It's simply being output directly to the print command. The print method then does this. When we right click here on the file name and choose run, we'll see the results of our Python program down here in the console area. In fact, the whole semester, all of your output from your programs will appear down here in the console, and you can adjust it like this by dragging the window up or down to see more if you have additional output. Now this is not using a variable, it's just using a string literal to print with. Now if we come over here, down here a little ways, and what if we want to define an actual variable? We say student count equals 30. Maybe this is the number of students in a course. When we say this, what we're really saying is that the left side is the name in memory. It's a location in memory where it's going to store the number 30. In high school algebra, this was called X and Y. Here we can name it anything that we want, but we're putting it in memory and we can reference this later. For example, we can say print student count. Now, what do you think this is going to print? Will it print the actual word student count, or will it print the number 30? We right click and we run the file. We'll see that it prints 30. It prints the content of this memory location that we've defined. Now also, you should know that this is called an integer. An integer in programming is a whole number, like 5 or 30 or 100 or 150. Now contrast that with, let's say, a fractional number. This is called a floating point number. The difference between the two is one is a whole number, right? There's no fractional component. Whereas this is, you might call it a decimal number, you might call it a fractional number. In computer science, we call it a floating point number. Just understand that there's a difference between how Python classifies this information. And again, if we keep going, another data type, and this is all data types. Data type is just another word of saying type of data, right? But let's say is published, and let's say false. Now, with Python, Boolean value, in most languages, this is called a Boolean value. Now, interestingly, in Python, this must be either true or false. And it has to be spelled exactly this way. It can't be spelled lowercase. It can't be lowercase, true or false. It's binary. It's either on or off. Up here, we have almost an infinite number of precision that we could add to this. We can make this as precise as we want. And we could add detail to this number. We could increase it to any number of numbers, theoretically. But down here, this is either on or off, true or false. There's no other gray areas or options for this. Now here, let's go to, let's try another data type as well. This data type is called a string. Let's call it content called Python programming. And we're setting course name, which is a location in memory. We're storing Python programming in this location. And just for consistency, we'll call this a string out here. And we could type all of these in. We could say print, let's see, we're printing student count already. So let's say print rating, print is published, print course name. In all of these cases, it doesn't print actual variable name. It prints the content of the variable name. The variable is being stored in memory, and it's printing out the content of it. That's why 30 and 4.3 and so forth is being printed. Now, interestingly, you should kind of be aware, just at a high level, that in other languages, the data type or the type of data that we're representing is actually indicated over here with something like this, or with something like this. But this does not work in Python. This is invalid syntax. In Python, you do not display the data type to the left. You don't control that in Python. Python manages this for you. And you say, well, if that's true, then why are you telling me about it? Because there will come a point in this course where you do need to understand the data types, and because you may have to change them. You may have to override how something is printed to the screen. As we get into more complexity, you'll need to know that in order to make your programs do certain things. And now is a good time to get familiar with the data types in Python. Now down here, we can change this to, let's say, 25. And if I run this, now interestingly, none of the rest of this changes because these are referencing specific locations in memory. And the student count, even though it's in memory, it didn't print because we didn't tell it to print. We printed the number 25, but this memory location student count still shows 30 in memory, even though we didn't print it. We're not changing anything up here with student count. When we do something like this, when we feed a number, or in this case a string up here, directly into the print function, this is called, in this case, an integer literal. Because we're not reading a variable like we're doing down here and then printing it. We're directly feeding in the variable. We're directly feeding in the integer. Now we can do the same thing with a string. We can type in, well, this is actually valid. We can type in 25 with quotation marks. And now rather than printing this as an integer, it's printing it as a string. It looks the same to you, but there is a subtle technical difference. Or we could type in ABC. And we can run that. And this is a string literal. If we feed something directly into the print function or any other function in Python, we're going to learn a lot of functions this semester. If we feed it directly in, then it's an integer literal or a string literal or a floating point literal. So there's the basic differences between a literal value and reading it from a memory location, or in other words, a variable. Now, interestingly, also, we can type comments into our program. Comments are indicated by the hashtag or pound sign right here. And you could keep a line of code from executing like we're doing at the top with this, but also you could document your program. You could say, well, in this case, it's obvious what's going on, but as your programs get longer and more complex, you should document your programs. It's actually considered in the grading process as well because it demonstrates your knowledge of the code that you wrote. So the obvious thing to say here might be that variable definitions maybe. And down here, outputting variables to the screen. Again, it's very obvious here, but understand that the hashtag or the pound sign keeps that line of code from executing. Of course, it's not really code here, but it causes Python just to ignore the entire line or a portion of the line. Here, Python runs this, but ignores this. This is very helpful in programming when debugging. If you want a block of code to not execute for some reason, you wanted to highlight the lines here of code, and you could type in, on your keyboard, if you're using a PC, it would be Control and the /. It will comment out those lines. So you can run the program without those lines being executed, which is very, very handy. And to uncomment them, just select the lines and again, press Control /, and they disappear.